filling in that bits and pieces. So I'm delighted to introduce Sam. It sounds like to this group that Sam needs no introduction. And reading over Sam's resume, Sam is a communicator, which is very cool, which is what we need to use when we talk about the climate. So Sam is now the Vice President of Strategic Communications with an organization called Oceantic. Am I saying that correctly? Previously known as the Business Network for Offshore Wind. Prior to that, he was the Public Information Officer for the Illinois Department of Revenue. And prior to that, the owner of his own company, Salustro Research. The educational background is an M.B.A. from the University of Chicago, Booth School of Business, and also Boston University, B.A. in History and International Relations. And I'm delighted that everybody had a chance to introduce and chit-chat and find connections in Delaware and beyond. And I'm tickled to say that some of you know Sam professionally. I know Sam because his mother-in-law is my next door neighbor. So again, a small Delaware story, and I'm just learning how famous you are, Sam. So if you want to start off and say anything that I missed, maybe a little bit about what your company does, and then your presentation.
I'll do that.
And I like your windmill behind you.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. Yeah. It's very nice to meet everyone. I have a presentation here. I'm going to try to keep it to 20 minutes or so. If you have burning questions, feel free to jump in at any time. I'm probably going to like skip over some of these slides pretty quickly, but we'll figure out a way to give them to you all afterwards anyway. My goal here is to talk about offshore wind in a political and economic frame. That's the basis of our organization. I would say if you have questions about environmental impact, environmental mitigation, etc., or even environmental benefits, I can answer a lot of those. Captain Paul is an expert in all of those, so it's very nice that he's also on here too. So if you like my presentation, then you should rope him into doing another one later on down the line. Yeah. But
got it written down.
Okay, so I'm going to share a screen. I'm going to talk from my organization. We are also a nonprofit organization. Someone give me a thumbs up that they can see this. Good, great. Okay, I'm going to talk from my organization. As Jill said, I'm also a Delaware resident, so at some times I'm going to sort of take off my hat and give my personal input every once in a while. But what we're trying to do as a nonprofit organization is just, frankly, give the information. We don't really get involved in bills all that much. We don't get involved in politics all that much. We're more. I should go into our mission statement, but we are the Oceantic Network. We're actually a membership-based education nonprofit, and we came out of Maryland. We're actually headquartered in Baltimore. Maryland passed an offshore wind bill back in 2013. It was helped by a group of businesses. Those group of businesses got offshore wind bill passed, and then they turned around and realized that they had no idea how to build offshore wind. So they started flying over to Europe and creating connections with European companies, and they formed this nonprofit. And what we mostly do is actually facilitate sort of business to business interactions, business to business teachings and education. And what we're trying to do is get as many companies into the domestic supply chain as possible so that we can actually build offshore wind. Because of that, we have a bunch of market information, investor information, etc. And we do deal with public stakeholders, giving them presentations like this, talking about, where are jobs being created, where's the economic benefit that comes along with offshore wind. So to give you context, that's the frame that I am going to be talking about today. And there's a lot of organizations out there, and they are primarily funded by the developer level. Nothing wrong with that. We're a little bit of the inverse, where most of our funding actually comes from sort of mom and pop shops, or ship repair guys, or the Delaware Bay Launch Company is one of our members. They're people that doing the piloting on Delaware River. So it's really the lower levels of the supply chain are the people that we're mostly working with. So context, this is a schematic of what an offshore wind farm could look like with its different components. I think everyone's become very familiar with wind power technology, on land, drive through Pennsylvania, you see these all over the place. The main difference is that these also need to be anchored somehow to the ocean floor. And that's where the complexity comes into play here. So you have your normal tower, you have a nacelle, you have blades, just like you would anywhere else. But now you have foundations that are either pile drived into the ground, a jacket foundation, which is just sort of sunk into the ground, or even when you get into really low depths, a floating foundation, which is adhered with cables and metal rope type structures. So you collect the power, you bring it to an offshore substation, and that power goes to shore. When we talk about offshore wind, we're really talking about scale. So because that these structures are out in the middle of the ocean, because the ocean wind power is much more frequent and reliable and stable, you're able to spread out across a much larger area, and you're able to make these much bigger because you're not actually constrained by normal things like roads. You don't have to, have a blade go out to a wind farm in Iowa and figure out how to go on the roads. So you can actually make these, extremely large. That allows us to capture much more energy than a traditional onshore wind farm. So I highlighted this box to the right. When we talk about these projects in the Atlantic Ocean or Pacific or Gulf of Mexico, we're talking about gigawatt scales. And a gigawatt wind farm can power 500,000 to 750,000 homes at any time. You're going to see megawatts, maybe a term that you're a little bit more familiar with. So 1,000 megawatts equals 1 gigawatt. When we talk about scale, though, there's a lot of complexities that come with it. These are extremely large pieces of equipment. They can only be transported by water, which means that even though we have an extremely robust onshore wind industry here in the United States, we can't really access a lot of those factories and a lot of those suppliers. We almost need to build an entirely new supply chain centered on ports, port cities, port locations, or some sort of waterway accessibility. They're extremely heavy components, so even if you have a port, you usually have to rebuild it and make it much stronger, able to endure the weight. And you need specialized vessels. You're building something out in the middle of the ocean. It's not easy at all. So you need these specialized vessels that can do it for you. And it's extremely long timelines. So I couldn't remember the gentleman's name, but he was talking about, he was familiar with Deepwater back in 2012. These projects are going to take 8 to 10 years to go from the drawing board to in reality. Part of that is because the environmental complexity of it. The federal government wants to make sure that they're not going to screw this up by approving a project, but it's also the supply chain complexity. These are enormous pieces of metal. You can think of them as the equivalent of the Eiffel Tower, and you need to transport these all over the world, all over the place, bring them into a central location. And then each of these wind farms, there's about 100 of these. So you need to coordinate that dance with 100 Eiffel Towers and get them installed in a timely manner. So coordinating the environmental piece with the supply chain piece, extremely difficult. So there's a slide that sort of illustrates, where that time is mostly spent. A lot of planning goes into it. Most of it is what they call site assessment, but essentially doing surveys and doing environmental research on an area to ensure that if we build a wind farm there, we're not going to degrade the environment in any way. And then the construction takes about 2 years, installation takes about 2 years. And then these are up for 25 years. So this is, when we talk about offshore wind, it's very much there's two types of jobs. There's like the installation short-term job, throwing up buildings, doing the actual install. But then there's the 25 years operations and maintenance that's going to be occurring. So I talked about scale. The other side of this is the scale of the market. The globe is turning to offshore wind as one of its primary renewable energy sectors moving forward. In the same way that, so in this chart, you can see up in the top left, global demand exceeds 1,000 gigawatts. So I just talked about, there's 1 gigawatt wind farms that we're putting up on the East Coast. 1,000 gigawatts is what the global demand is. And this third number here is extremely important. Global demand is over 1,000. We only have 56 gigawatts operating right now. Global ambitions are enormous. They're turning to this as one of their prime cornerstones of their future energy markets. And we frankly just don't have the infrastructure, supply chain, et cetera, to meet global demand. Now, if the globe is demanding all that, and we're trying to get off the ground here in the United States, a lot of the existing supply chain is just going to do Europe or do Asia because they have bigger markets in Africa. So one of the focuses of my organization is to try and bring in as many American manufacturing, as American suppliers as possible, because we really feel like there's so much demand outside of our borders that's where the attention is going to go. Here in the United States, we have a demand about 100. So, 8% of global demand is here in the United States, and we have almost nothing operating. So 42 megawatts, so that's 0.042 gigawatts that we have operating here in the United States, just getting going. Another way of looking at global demand, just skyrocketing. The reasons that the globe is adopting offshore wind are very much the same that we're going to have here in the United States. It's a renewable, clean energy source. You can build it out in the middle of the ocean. So if you're landlocked, or if you're a land constrained area, this is a great energy source. So when you think about places like Europe, where there's a lot of people and there's not a lot of land to share around, they are looking to offshore wind as almost their primary energy source at this point. Demand really skyrocketed too, thanks to a little bit to, policy or technological advancements that we had within the industry. But the Russian war on Ukraine also had a huge influence on our industry, in that all these European countries realized that they couldn't rely on Russian gas to power their homes in the middle of the winter. So they needed new sources of energy, and they turned to offshore wind as the most accessible one. So a very important last thing to keep in mind is how we structure a regulatory system here in the United States for offshore wind. States are the demand drivers. If you think about your classic economics, states are the demand, the federal government is the supply. States say, we want this much power, we want it at this time frame, this is generally where we want to pull it from. The federal government is the one that will identify appropriate areas for development. There are a lot of other people out on the ocean, not only fishermen, but the military is out there. The Coast Guard is out there. We have freight and shipping that is out there. And here in the mid-Atlantic, we also have NASA that has a base down in Virginia and is very concerned about what goes on in the ocean because of their activities. So the federal government identifies appropriate areas for development. They lease those areas to developers. And even if they lease an area, they still say, well, we still have to go through environmental review. So then they do the environmental review with these developers. So states are the demand. They're pushing the market forward. The federal government is the supply. They're figuring out how much they're actually going to allow to be developed. And the private developers that you may hear about, so here in Delaware, we have Ørsted or US Wind are our two primary developers. They're the ones who are sort of in between. This is all of the areas that have been leased by the federal government for deployment. As you can see, it's heavily concentrated here on the East Coast. We have a large continental shelf, so it's shallower water here on the East Coast. We have which makes it much cheaper, and we have the technology to do it today. High wind speeds and land constrained states. So you have states that can't really do solar, or they can do a bit of solar, they can do a bit of land-based wind, but they just don't have the acreage to really do it. That's especially true for New Jersey, and New York is a big state, but all the people live right down in New York City. So naturally, the East Coast is the first market that's really been developed. You see projects starting out on the West Coast. They have very deep waters out there, so we've needed a technological transformation in order to access that area. And then down in the Gulf of Mexico, you see a bunch of projects. That's primarily being driven by the actual supply chain, because we are borrowing very heavily from the oil and gas industry. They're very good at building things in the middle of the ocean. We're building things in the middle of the ocean. And this is a way for oil and gas to diversify into a new, business plan or business economy. So they're down in Houston, and then they're down in Louisiana, and they've been helping build the East Coast, and now they're looking at their next door, and they want to develop that area. We also had a governor down in Louisiana who was extremely concerned about coastal erosion and the fact that hurricanes were just battering the state. And he, frankly, was a very aggressive climate person, pushing the industry forward down there. So, color schematics real quick. Yellow means that the area has been leased. That does not mean that a developer is able to build yet, because they still need to go through environmental review. The green areas mean that these are projects that have come to some sort of financial agreement with a state. These are large. I should go back to previous slides. We're talking about scale. These projects are about $4, $6, $8 billion. These are enormously expensive projects. And because of that, the way that you can actually financially build these is to come to 20-year power agreements, 25, 30-year power agreements. And the only entities right now in the United States capable of, I'm going to call it risk, but taking on that risk are state power entities. So down in Maryland, the state of Maryland has come up with a legislative requirement that offshore wind be bought, and the state is the one, doing that financial transaction. So the green areas are ones that have come to some sort of financial commitment with a neighboring state, to be able to build. A spattering of green. So, your first indication that, not only have we leased a ton of different areas, a spattering of green, a bunch of projects have actually, come to some sort of financial agreement. So they're moving forward. And we actually do have 2 commercial scale projects being built right now in US waters. We have a couple pilot projects, but these are the first commercial scale projects. So it's South Fork Wind and Vineyard Wind. You may hear about them in the news every once in a while, but 2 projects that combine to about 932 megawatts. So doing your conversion again, that's about 0.9 gigawatts. That's almost a gigawatt. When they're finished, these will produce enough power for about 500,000 homes in New York and New England. And I want to give you sense of scale. So the ship on the right, the green ship, those are the foundations that they adhere to the ocean floor. And here on the right, you can see the turbine actually being installed. Each one of these blades is the length of a football field, is to give you scale proportions. So we've leased a bunch of areas. Some have come to some sort of financial agreement with states, and we actually have a market. The business network to really help our members understand their financial opportunities. We track the market as closely as possible. We can very proudly say that, within the United States, despite the fact that we only have I think today, I think we have 13 or 14 turbines actually spinning out in the ocean. We've been able to garner $25 billion in investments into this industry. That's rebuilding ports, that's building new ships, that's building new factories, that's workforce development, that's rebuilding transmission lines, because I'm sure all of you being in green drinks understand that transmission is our Achilles heel to enter our energy transition. So rebuilding transmission lines, etc. A bunch of charts and stuff on the right, but the main point is suppliers, contracts, the velocity of contracts being handed out between suppliers has increased about 400% over the last couple of years. The number of companies that have publicly said that they want to be involved in offshore wind has grown by about 200%. All of these numbers, blah, 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 what they really mean is that this market is really like becoming a juggernaut and moving forward. Real quick, why do states want offshore wind? We talked about this before. States have renewable energy portfolio requirements that they have to meet. This on the right. Oh, my cursor's on the wrong thing. The thing on the far right, a lot of states have generational assets going offline. That means power plants are going offline and they need to recoup the power. Half the people on this call just bought an EV. We need to figure out how to power those EVs. So, energy demand is going up. We're trying to transition to clean energy, and we have coal plants going offline. That means that we need to get our energy from somewhere. States also want offshore wind because it is an extremely good job creator. We have a national goal of deploying 30 gigawatts. So we're building one right now. Triple it is what our national goal is to do by 2030. Probably not going to hit it, but that's not important. If we do that, we probably create about 45,000 jobs in this country. And if you're an economic person, you're creating 45,000 jobs, and then you're inducing another 25,000 jobs on top of that within the supply chain somewhere. A lot of it is going to be short-term jobs. It's very important to realize that. But a fourth of these job creations are going to be long-term, 25-year-long jobs. The supply chain to do these components on the right. So South Fork Wind is a New York project. Even though it's a New York project, it is being run out of a port in New London, Connecticut. And it's created about 165 jobs when they're actually going to build it. Just redeveloping the port creates 400 jobs. Building the ship that's going to service it for a lifetime is being done in Louisiana. That's going to create 200 jobs. Building the power cable from the turbine to the shore, that's creating about 200 jobs down in South Carolina. Creating the ladders and internal components in the town, so et cetera, et cetera. But you can see how just building one of these creates a lot of local jobs, but it also creates all these supply chain jobs that emanate out from the project. A map of state demand for offshore wind, escalating, very similar to global demand for offshore wind. You are very familiar with the energy transition, but once demand really starts skyrocketing. These are the states that have sort of raised their hand and said that they want offshore wind in blue, obviously on the coast because the ocean is on the coast. But I fly out to Cleveland and Chicago every once in a while because they're actually talking about doing offshore wind in the Great Lakes. We're calling it Great Lakes wind instead of offshore wind, Great Lakes wind. Our powerhouses, you will not be shocked to know that New Jersey and New York and Maryland are really our leaders when it comes to offshore wind. Massachusetts, Rhode Island have traditionally been the first, but it's New York, New Jersey, and Maryland are the places that are really pushing the market forward. And then out in California created a pretty insanely high goal. Insanely, not as in like we're not going to do it, but it's just California, so they just do everything enormous out there, and it's just ridiculous, Gonna fly through a couple of these slides here because I want to get to Delaware stuff, but reiterating a lot of points. These are companies in our supply chain database, even though it's going to be a coastal industry, the supply chain emanates all throughout the United States. It's obviously going to be a little bit more concentrated on the East Coast, but giving you an idea of, these are companies that want to work in offshore wind, and they're up in Fargo, North Dakota, But when we start talking about larger manufacturing investments, those are really tied to the states that have said that they want power. I'm going to go through why that happens, because we're going to talk about Delaware, but just, put it in your brain for a second that if you're a state and you're going to buy offshore wind, you're probably going to get more investment from the market because, you've already said there's going to be a market here and it's going to be a long-term thing. So come here and invest. The things that break that pattern is Midwest steel mills. Obviously, we need a lot of steel. So, the Midwest, upper Midwest has been doing that forever. So, providing a lot of that primary source material. And then, like I said before, the Gulf of Mexico has been doing offshore structures forever. So it makes sense that, some early investment is going down there. Same sort of view. Blue is manufacturing. Orange is shipbuilding. A lot of shipbuilding goes on the Gulf. It just goes on there, but also in the Great Lakes. And then purple is ports. So there's 30 ports that are spending money redeveloping themselves in order to serve the offshore wind industry. What my organization is primarily concerned about is this scaling. So we've talked about how we're building 1 gigawatts of projects right now. Our national goals are 30 by 2030. That's right around the corner. Long-term state demand is much closer to 100. So how do we do what we're doing this summer, which frankly was a Herculean effort? How do we do that 100 times over? There's a million different ways why offshore wind has a scaling problem. Transmission, global demand, we're competing for scarce resources, local concerns. You all are here in Delaware, and the beach communities are frankly having a very loud conversation about whether they want this. Obviously, that's happening everywhere. Workforce, and as I talked before, the federal government's in charge of this, and the state government's in charge of this, so that bifurcation of responsibilities creates a lot of friction. Just going to say real fast what this slide is illustrating is to meet global demand, the global supply chain needs to quadruple, quintuple. I don't know what times 10 is in that language, but essentially the global supply chain cannot meet global demand today. So if a new factory starts up and it's not here in the United States, they're probably serving the global market and they're probably not serving us. Biden administration has been extremely aggressive in trying to get offshore wind off the ground as much as possible. There's been a lot of inside the administration efforts to streamline federal processes. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act gave a lot of money to rebuild ports and transmission systems, both crucial to our industry. And then the Inflation Reduction Act, very generous tax credits, not only for developers to facilitate actually doing the project, but also to manufacturers building the components that will go into an offshore wind farm. This is the frowny face slide. So you may have been reading about the economic troubles that have been hitting offshore wind. Extremely true. Like I said, that these are, we're signing 25-year-long contracts. When we built these contracts in the first place, we didn't really put in protections for economic catastrophe. And a lot of these contracts just don't make sense financially anymore. So the red are all the contracts, all the power contracts that have been terminated by a project developer. And these orange ones are like either likely to, or the state is trying to figure out some way of rectifying it in some manner. So read the newspaper, offshore wind industry is in trouble. Yes and no. So yes, as in we've literally had to rip up a bunch of contracts because they absolutely made no sense in today's economic world anymore. However, like I said, states really, really, really want offshore wind, and they've been moving heaven and earth to figure out a way to help financially rectify these projects that are happening. So, what some of these states are doing is they're ripping up a contract and they're saying, we're going to rip this up, but rebid in as quickly as possible, and we'll give you a yes or no if we're going to accept it. And that's happening all over the East Coast. So it's essentially like every state is trying to like um just redo the power contracts that they signed with these developers, back in 2017, back in 2018, back in 2019, before we knew what COVID was. The real result of that, this everything is still going to happen. All these projects are still going to happen. They're going to happen 2 years later than we thought in the first place, or they're going to happen 3 years later than we thought. The second thing that's going to happen is there's just general investor uncertainty as this reorganization takes place. So we've actually seen a little bit of a freeze within the investment market, building new factories in the United States, or building new workforce training centers, or building new ships here over the past year as everyone has reorganized it. But in the end, we're building better contracts. Our states are working together better. We're building, the supply chain actually has a chance to catch up with demand a little bit. So we're going to be a better market. Just everything is going to be 2 years delayed than we wanted it to be. So a short spotlight on Delaware, because there's legislation here in Delaware. I'm going to talk about it real quick. First, Delaware right now, despite we here in Delaware, we are not actively buying the power, but the power is actually moving through our state, and the state of Delaware is benefiting from that. So the state of Maryland is one of the big buyers for offshore wind, but there's no way to transport power through Ocean City and across the Chesapeake to Baltimore. So it goes up through Delaware, up to the I-95 corridor, and then gets dispersed from there. US Wind, which is one of the project developers, is negotiating with the governor's office right now on, what are the lease agreements to be able to do that. So they spent $20 million buying land. They're going to spend $200 million building a new substation down in the Indian Creek area. Anyone know what that's called? It's that old coal plant, Indian River coal plant down in Milford. I can't remember what the town is called. Because power is
Indian River coal plant, but
yeah, so they're going to build it right next to that Indian River
right.
coal plant. The coal plant's going to go offline. So $200 million on transmission upgrades. That's jobs for like IBEW workers, and that's jobs for union guys who do that transmission work. $300 million in repair savings over 20 years. That power is being injected directly into the middle of Delaware. No longer is Delaware sourcing its power from, Western Pennsylvania, but the power is coming from right offshore. So it's going to create a lot of economic transmission benefits that should save ratepayer dollars, about $10 a year for everyone's bill. It's also even though Delaware's not quite in the game yet, there's a lot of jobs that are already coming to Delaware. There's going to be a ton of traffic on the Delaware River, so the pilots of Delaware are going to get jobs, shepherding the ships up and down the Delaware River and through the bay. SIOW at the University of Delaware is one of the global centers of offshore wind thought right here in Delaware, and there's actually a major steel provider who has a plant just across the border in Maryland and has a plant in Delaware, but uses the Maryland plant because Maryland is buying power. But it's a Delaware company with a Maryland plant that's providing a ton of the steel to a lot of the Central Atlantic projects. So,
did you say what plant, what developer that is?
It's the Crystal Steel Fabricators is the steel mill, and they're down in Delmar, and then they are part of the Orsted supply chain, Orsted is a project developer that has about 7 projects on the East Coast.
Thanks.
The developer negotiating directly with the governor's office is called US Wind. Very confusing, but their name is US Wind, and they're doing the Marwin Momentum project off the Delaware coast. Okay, real quick. So Delaware might become a buyer offshore wind. A study just came out from DENREC, which gave guidance to how Delaware could structure what we call a procurement, a power purchase procurement. DENREC says that they want to be in charge of everything. They're going to draft the legislation. Interestingly, they're really looking for flexibility. And they're also saying that any economic development or workforce development is welcome, but we don't want to drive the price up. The flip side of that is a state like New York, which says, you know, frankly, price be damned, we want as many jobs as possible. We'll pay whatever we need to, just build a steel plant right there, because that's what we really want, is the jobs. Delaware is DENREC has suggested taking an alternative thing of keeping the price as low as possible, in part because Delaware has never had traditional heavy industry, but also, you know, Delaware is going to get a lot of benefits by just being in the middle of it all anyway. I don't have time for this, but essentially, a state procurement, there's a lot of different ways of doing it. So DENREC is going to study all these different ways of doing it. At the same time that Delaware is looking at this, be aware that states are up and down the East Coast are doing a lot of these things. So, you know, what I didn't put in there is, if Delaware does buy power, they're looking at 1 gigawatt. A state like New Jersey is buying power right now, and they're looking at buying 4 gigawatts. New York is buying 4 gigawatts. Maryland is buying 1, but they have goals of buying 6 more after that. So, you know, Delaware is in competition with other states in order to actually secure, you know, there's less available power than, frankly, there is demand right now in these states. So Delaware will be in competition with these other states. Illustrating that further, the federal government is going to identify new areas for development. Probably should have done this earlier, but there are 2 projects off the Delaware coast. This top gray one is called Skipjack, with the Orsted developer that I mentioned previously, and the bottom one is US Wind, and they call Marwin or Momentum Wind, depending on the day, but they're down here. So the federal government may lease a new 3rd area right here. It's important to know that all these 3 areas combined only equal 6 gigawatts. So even if you built them out all the way, it's only 6 gigawatts, and Maryland has an 8.5 gigawatt goal. So the federal government has not identified enough area for Maryland, who's already buying all the power. Another thing that the state of Delaware is really going to have to figure out is how to be competitive with its neighbors right now. I think I'm going to end it a little anticlimactically, but I think I'm going to sort of end it there, where I don't think I have any other brilliant thoughts. So Delaware is going to go through this process. It would be great for them to join and become another offshore wind state. It's not easy for stakeholders. This is going to be a little difficult decision, because they're going to balance economic benefits in raw job creation with keeping the price low and probably keeping it a little bit more popular. And at the same time, it will probably try to work with the state of Maryland and sort of buy power with the state of Maryland. But the fact is that states are in direct competition with each other to secure this power, because each of them knows how much power they need to create a clean economy, and they're fighting over this available offshore wind to do it. So DENREC says that they're going to possibly have legislation this summer or this spring at some point. So it'll be very interesting to see what they come up with and how fast the governor's office is willing to move, or if they're going to wait a little while longer. So that is a whirlwind of information. No one interrupted me because you are all too polite. So there's either questions, or I didn't communicate very effectively, or I communicated extremely effectively. So one of these three was true or false.
Well, I would go with effectively. Um, I guess, let's see, what do I do here? Shall we just raise hands maybe with questions? And can you see the people and you want to call on them, Sam? Would that work for the question
Yeah, sure.
department?
That'd be great.
Okay.
Yeah.
All righty, so
Jill, I
question,
put a question in the chat too. You might check there.
okay. You want to look at that, Sam?
Yeah, there's a couple. I'm looking at Ann Kirby. Is 25 years the life cycle, or is that the extent of a typical power purchase agreement? Right now, that's the typical power purchase agreement. If you talk to project developers, they say that these things will be great for 30 years or 35 years. States are unwilling to take that risk right now, so states are usually looking at 20 or 25. There will be an opportunity to what they call repower them at the end of the power purchase agreement. BOEM also has I don't know if Captain Paul knows this, but BOEM also has restrictions on the time limit. You know, they're leasing the area, so they have I think it's 30 years that BOEM, that the federal government allows you to use an area. So there's different time parameters. The fact is that with these new wind farms, we don't quite know how long, but the industry kind of thinks 30 years is possible. It just may not be that the US has a regulatory structure to support that.
Let me just jump in here real quick and point out, Phil Smith, we were talking about transmission. And again, this is a Citizens Climate Lobby, is supporting the Big Wires Act, which will support and speed transmission. And if you want to read about that and contact your congressional delegation, Phil has put that up in the chat. So I just want to highlight that.
I think I can see hands. So Peggy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. It was really interesting. And you hinted at the need for urgency on the part of Delaware, and particularly lawmakers. Do you want to expand on that? Is how I mean, what with New Jersey with a goal of 11 gigawatts and Maryland 8.5 gigawatts, what do you think we're talking here? I mean,
So
one little place off of Delaware shores.
So a couple different considerations. Number one, these projects will take a long time to actually build. So even if you come to a power agreement tomorrow, it's probably not going to be built until 2031 or 2032. So you have sort of societal health benefits that you want to weigh, which is we won't be able to deliver clean power onto the grid until the 2030s. So do you still have, you know, your coal plant running or your natural gas plant running in that time frame? Number two, going back to this map, which I'm sorry you can't see very well, there's not much area, and there's very hungry people around that want that area. So if you're going to secure some sort of part of this, you're probably going to have to move pretty fast. Now, you can wait. The federal government has been very clear that if you have a state goal, they're going to figure out a way to meet it. It just may not be tomorrow and may be further down the line. So you can wait till the federal government works through its process and comes up with, appropriate area, etc. But a state like Maryland has an 8.5 gigawatt goal. I expect it to grow. New Jersey has an 11 gigawatt goal. I expect that to grow. The electrification of our economy is really driving up demand in ways that we don't quite expect it. The state of Virginia is having really hard power problems right now because they keep building data centers, and data centers are just huge power sucks. So, so these states probably are going to want more power in the future. So it's a little bit of a jostling with your neighbors that, you know, if you're going to get something, you probably should move a little faster than not. Future areas are going to just be further and further and further offshore. They'll probably be more expensive because you get into deeper waters and that technology is a little harder. And then if you do get some sort of economic benefits from this, a lot of those economic benefits, a lot of those early investments are going to become core of the industry. And those investments kind of get made early. They're not going to get made later. At the same time, you could do it, you know, this is me being very objective, where you could wait and prices of offshore wind might go down in the future. So you could get something for cheaper later. These are the things that stakeholders really need to balance. So I say that, I'll take off my hat and I'll put on, I'm a Delawarean hat. You just have to move fast, because if you don't move fast, then Maryland is going to take everything away and New Jersey is going to take everything away. And you're going to have a goal and you're not going to be able to buy it from anywhere. So it's great that we got a goal, but we got nowhere to buy it from. So that's my Delawarean untarnished thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you.
Charlie.
Yes, am I,
Oh no, you're
Yeah.
going great, and then you cut out.
oh, sorry.
Okay, we got you. Yeah.
My question is about the cost of floating offshore wind turbines. It's a little more expensive than regular offshore wind. Do you have
Mhm.
any ideas from the European experience or someplace else? How much more is it? Is it twice as expensive? Is it 1.2 times more expensive?
Off the top of my head, I'm going to say it's about between 50 and 75% more expensive today to do floating. And what floating is anything beyond a certain depth, you'll have to do some sort of floating thing. And it's a big question mark because the Europeans have a very gradual shelf decline. So they've been able to do monopiles for a while. They've been able to do, like adhering to the ocean floor in traditional manners for a while. And now they're starting to get out to areas, but it's floating, but it's not much deeper than what their other projects are. Here in the United States, we have like cliffs. We have continental cliffs, and it just drops right off. And it's like a mile down that we're going to try and figure this out. In a weird way, a lot of the innovation is coming out of the oil and gas sector because they've been doing this for a long time. So we actually have some of the best engineers in the United States on this. Our laboratories have actually been studying this for a long time. And there's a real hope that because of our traditional technological prowess, frankly, in the oil and gas industry, that we're actually going to be able to become a leader in this, because we will have to do deeper depths and we'll have to figure out this faster. The Biden administration is putting a ton of research money into this. They have a goal. I'm sure you all, in your areas, you may have some sort of earth shot goal in your own areas, but it's essentially just like a focused R&D injection of funding into a green energy area. And we have one for floating. And what they really want to do is lower the cost of floating 70% over the next 10 years or something. And that would put it, it will always be more expensive than regular offshore wind, just because of the technological, requirements, but at least you can get it a lot closer to being, comparable.
Because Charlie has his hand up.
Yeah, more questions, or you got?
Charlie has his hand up.
No, I meant to lower my hand. I just didn't get around to touching that. Thanks, Captain.
And Peggy, you're right that the wind is stronger further out, but even with that, you should be able to generate more electricity. And they're actually talking about making the turbines like even larger the further offshore you're going to go in order to capture. So there are some, economics that you can capture from that, but in general, it's just always going to be more expensive because, you're going to need submarines that go a mile down to help you like adhere stuff to the ocean floor that far down. So it's just always going to be more expensive in the end.
I'd be willing to take that bet with you, Sam.
All right.
Call me in 20 years. I bet it's going to be cheaper offshore floating.
I'll be happy to be wrong. I'll be very, very happy to be wrong. But yeah. I feel like you're talking with some knowledge that
No, it's just my guess that if you've got like a boat and you have an anchor, you throw the anchor over the side. If it goes down 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 feet, it's just the cost of the rope, which is not as expensive as a monopile.
Mhm.
So it makes sense to me that a floating system would be cheaper.
a lot
Plus,
of the
you've got
you've
got the better scale of stronger winds further out as well.
the main cost drivers are actually in the operations and maintenance phase of it, because under the current schematics, what you need to do is literally tow the thing back to shore in order to do maintenance on it. And on top of that, the serial production requirements get really hard because what you really need to build are these enormous metal cylinders with the current designs that they're using right now, these enormous metal cylinders or parts that can't be produced on a factory floor, and they can only be produced at the shoreline or at the port. And that's what the main cost driver is the actual, that part of the structure. Because a monopile, you can just do them over and over and over again and just shoot them out of a factory. With this, you're doing everything outside. Serial production gets really hard, so the coordination gets hard. Now, there's really cool research that's going into it. They're using a lot of 3D printing to solve these kind of problems. It's really cool to see what they're talking about and thinking about. But that's the main cost driver. It's not, you're correct, and a rope is cheaper than a monopile, but the actual base that you're building is much more complex than a monopile is.
Okay.
Ruth Ann asking about University of Delaware. Yeah, I'm sure you all know Will Cupton at the university. He's been one of the leaders in offshore wind for a long time. University of Delaware hosts annual symposiums all the time, and people come from all over the world to come to the university here. Delaware was probably, you guys may have remembered that they were talking about doing an offshore wind project up in Martha's Vineyard, and Teddy Kennedy killed it. Delaware was actually going to be like the first commercial project in the 2010s, and that didn't happen. And then we waited 10 more years to actually build this industry. So Delaware has actually weirdly been at the forefront of this, despite the fact that it doesn't have a foot in the game right now. But there's a lot of intellectual experience that still exists in the state because of these early attempts that happened here in Delaware. And frankly, the current market that we have right now would not exist if not for places like the University of Delaware. What's the stumbling block? Honestly, the state politically wasn't, the state, my guess is that the state political system was interested in this in 2010 and then not interested in it when it actually kind of came along. And there was, these projects started getting much more expensive, much faster, and that probably was turned off, state of Delaware into into something like this. Like it went from a $500 million project to a $5 billion project. So that probably scared Delaware. I'm not saying it scared Delaware off, but it made it a little less appealing to state policymakers. But I probably ask you that because I moved here about 4 years ago, so I'm taking a good guess. Yeah.
Peggy has her hand up.
I don't mean to be hogging questions, but in the new DENREC report, they talk about the possibility of using OREX. So what would your recommendation be? They say either just a regular agreement or using OREX, offshore wind renewable energy certificates.
I have actually no strong thoughts on this. This starts getting to a level of complexity that I am thankfully just I don't quite understand the economics, and we're at the Oceantic Network. That's the type of question that I would turn to someone else and ask them that question, an actual expert in some of this stuff, and ask them.
That's why I'm scared.
I can say that the state of Maryland is contemplating moving from an OREC to a PPA, and the state of Massachusetts is contemplating moving away from a PPA to something more like an OREC. So I hope that answers your question of nobody really knows. And everyone probably has an opinion on it. And I hope that's not the stumbling block. I know some states went with ORECs because they had a REC structure in place. So it just sort of made sense for them to do it that way. But there are people that think it's horrible and there are people that think it's great. And I don't know. I'm not smart enough to frankly have an opinion one way or the other. Phil. Phil, we can see you
Gotta
talking.
get
Can't hear you, Phil, for some reason.
You're on mute, Phil. Yeah, he's buried. Caesar Rodney has taken over his microphone.
Mary asked about right of ways on transmission. Yeah, I would actually have asked Peggy about something like this because Delaware is one of the first states that I've heard about transmission right of ways over roadway being an impairment. I haven't heard about that in other states. So I heard about that in Delaware a couple weeks ago. I'm interested in that. As you've seen, the conversation around having a cable move from a project to land and connect into the grid is a very politically charged part of this conversation. So most of the conversations I see in states are around that, frankly, like when it crosses the beach, what's that kind of conversation? But Delaware was the first state I kind of heard about there being sort of inland problems with that. When states compete, who actually benefits? The companies who are developing? Not really, to be honest. You can claim that the fact is that these project developers are building 7 to 8, I'm going to say $5 to $7 billion projects, and they're not going to invest that kind of capital unless they're going to make some sort of profit. Just straight up, that's the capitalist system that we live in today. So these project developers are looking for some sort of return, 7%, 8%. We've seen a lot of them want to work in states like New York, who have signaled that they're willing to pay a higher price if they can get economic benefits that go along with it. In that case, I would say, even though the state of New York is competing and setting a higher price, they are doing some sort of equation internally to ensure that their people are still getting a good benefit from it. So yes, we're paying a higher price, but 2,000 people are going to go to work, and we're going to get all this income tax revenue and all these economic knock-on effects at the same time. So I'm not, it's, the flip side is that if you're a project developer and you have a project and you sit on it for a while waiting for the right state to come along with the right price point and everything, then you're not making any money too. So you've just invested a ton of money in survey work and auctions, and you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get yourself ready, and you're not making any money on that. So they want to move fast too. So both sides want to move fast, and I'm not quite sure that we can credibly say that the state competition is bad. It does get bad when it comes to the supply chain, because the states are all competing for these investments, and it would work a lot better and it would lower the costs for everyone if the state of New Jersey says, hey, we'll buy towers from New York, and the state of New York says, hey, we'll buy monopiles from New Jersey, and they stop competing over the manufacturing investments. That's the point where and a lot of states are working together to do that. Anyone else? Otherwise, I have a screaming child downstairs that I'm probably going to go attend to. And enjoy this rare snowy night that we all have together.
And I have to say, one of the cutest little kids around. That's absolutely wonderful. That is, there's been some discussion about the pushback from local people. And I think that the folks from New Jersey who were pushing against the offshore wind, the naysayer people kind of took credit for, I guess it was Ørsted pulling out of that. How much power do those pushback people have, and would that actually be happening if it weren't for some of the people behind that pushback, like the Caesar Rodney folks?
Yeah, I can credibly say that I don't think that they've had a real impact. I think Captain Paul would severely disagree with me. I see him shaking his head, but
No, I do agree.
You do? Okay.
Totally. Yeah, I think that they're just the loudest idiots in the room, and they get a lot of attention. And they, when push comes to shove, it's some little accountant guy in Denmark said, "Hey, this isn't working."
Yeah, I mean, these are global companies that are doing these developments, and they're sort of balancing a global portfolio. And what Joe was talking about is project number 19 right here on this map. Number 19 was on the verge of installation, and they pulled out at the last possible second and shocked everyone. Everyone was surprised. And what the company was been going through some troubles and had financial difficulties across their entire portfolio. And this is probably one way for them to balance their portfolio. I'll say it like that. They also had a problem where they couldn't, I talked about, you need specialized installation vessels. They couldn't get this one ship, and it would have been like 2 years before they got it. And that would have really driven up their costs, because they would have had to reorganize their entire supply chain and to accommodate it. And it was almost like it frankly wasn't worth the headache. So they just didn't do it because they had other stuff to go do. The lessons are, number one, that's the thing that we're really afraid of, is that they can go build stuff anywhere. So they're probably going to go build something somewhere else. And in the American market, we're always going to be in competition with that. Number two, supply chain constraints, when they hit, are really problematic. And it's like, one little thing. It's like you're building something from IKEA and you're missing one dumb screw and the whole thing doesn't work. It's like that's the complexity of an offshore wind supply chain. And that, you know, our organization really strives to kind of fill in those gaps as much as possible. And then number three, while I don't think that these opposition groups can stop a project, they can try really hard. What they're mostly doing is souring the milk and making it that by and large, the population is less inclined to support offshore wind as they frankly should be or generally would be if all things being equal. And that just makes it harder down the line to continue support for offshore wind. And then as a second thing, what we get concerned about is, you know, if there's some guy in Europe and he wants to spend $1 billion on a factory here in the United States, and he picks up the newspaper and it's all full of these opposition groups. And he says, well, I want to invest there. That seems like a mess. I'm going to go invest somewhere else. That's the other thing that we get really worried about. So I don't think that they have immediate impacts, but they may have sort of longer term structural impacts that, you know, are not helpful. But that is to say, they're not as powerful as you think they are, but they're not as weak as you probably wish they are too.
Any last minute questions? Sam, it's been awesome. I've learned a tremendous amount and feel like I'm a little more up to date now. Jill,
Frank, you're
Jill-
absolutely right that the New Jersey Democrats actually had a better election despite all of that and despite all the noise. New Jersey Democrats.
It's a great
running.
point. It's like the
Yeah.
silent majority.
Yeah.
we need to be louder
Yeah,
or
big
get
time.
louder than we have been.
A link understanding
we need
what
to
the-
wake up angry like they do.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I want
Um,
to do that, but we do
I
need
don't
to
wanna
get
do that.
louder.
Yeah.
Ruth Ann, about I'll try and post some things. The federal government gives out information in very scientific terms, so it's not very PR-y, but they do combat this information just in very boring ways. But people like Captain Paul are out. I don't know if you have stuff, but a great resource is the National Wildlife Foundation. Is someone that is very actively pushing back on this, and they're an environmental firm, and they're very credible about this because they care about whales and they care about the environment, and they're extremely in favor of offshore wind. So them, the Audubon Society, the Bird Society, very in favor, and they do a lot of pushing back. And the state of New Jersey tries to do some things, but you know, it's also like you don't totally want your federal or state governments, you know, getting down in the dirt like that too. So it's kind of on us to do that. But I'll try and post some of those links. But NWF and the Audubon Society are great first steps.
I have a blog, Sam, that NWF, they're my leader, you know.
I did. Okay. Okay.
But anglers for offshore wind power .org online and on Facebook, you could just search that and it'll come right up. There's a blog and it talks about, you know, everything from EMFs to whales to different types of foundations to digging cables, all pertinent stuff, you know.
Do you blog about movies and baseball too, or is it very focused?
I know movies and definitely know baseball. I'm a total fish head, so I'm clueless.
Peggy, you have some of that on the power site, don't you? Are you there, Peggy? Did I lose you?
I'm just posting our website address, Jill.
Thank you. Yeah, I just like to say when they ever talk about birds, I say the Audubon Society is all about offshore wind. They support offshore wind. So there we go. Thank you.
That's my email address. I'm sorry, I'm gonna be rude and I'm gonna run.
Thanks so
but
much,
It
Sam.
was very
Thank you,
nice
thank you, thank you.
meeting
Give
everyone,
you-
and I'll see
give your-
you. I'll see you at Wegmans, or I'll see you at Brouhaha or something like that. So if you
Give
see
your
me, come
baby a
say
hug and a
hi.
kiss.
I will. Thank you, Jill. I
All
appreciate
right,
it.
thanks a bunch, Sam.
Thanks,
right.
Captain Paul. Good to see you. Bye.
Okay, see you guys. When's the next one? February 19th, and I will be following up with an email after a bit to tell you what that's gonna be. Does anybody have any more comments to share with the group? Thank you all for all you do for the environment. And thank you for the new people who came. Marty, I see you, and all sorts of good people. So thank you, and keep the faith. So
Amen.
see you next month, next month.
Night.
Thanks, Jill.
Good night. Thank you,
Thanks,
Dee.
guys.
Go Eagles.
Hey, yeah.
Take care, guys.